Also, in addition just to commending Vadim on the conference, maybe I could also say that it's been a real pleasure to watch economic sociology develop here in Russia. And the work that you've done here at the Higher School of Economics in your online journal, Economic Sociology, bringing ideas from the United States and Western Europe, sponsoring new ideas from young people, sending your folks to our conferences and inviting us here is a real inspiration. And I myself am very happy that I'm part of your community, that my work, I see economic sociology, your online journal, as an outlet for my ideas. Now, today, I need to first tell you that the work I'm going to present, the first part of it is work that I developed with my former student friend Daniel Bayunza, and the second part is with Matteo Prato. And in talking with Vadim about the topic of my presentation today, there were two criteria that came into play. And the first is that I wanted to show that it's possible to not get stuck doing only one method. And so the first part of the talk is ethnographic. Well, actually, the first part of the talk is kind of conceptual background, but then the first empirical material is ethnographic, and it reports on our observations, actually across 3 years, but we restrict this particular paper to observations on about one merger arbitrage desk in one trading room on one morning. So it's ethnographic and those kinds of constraints. The second part of the presentation with Matteo is big N quantitative network analytic work in which we actually have several million analyst firm observations. So it's possible to be an ethnographer and a network analyst. Now there was a second criteria, and that was that there were several possibilities of papers to present, and it seemed to be really interesting to present one following the work of Karin Norsetina. Karin and I see each other so regularly at conferences and have a lot of interaction. And as you're going to see, I mean, with the title, Peripheral Vision in Financial Markets, obviously I've learned a lot from Karin. I think also about scopic markets. I also think about attention structures. But I also am hoping to try to take some next steps. And so we don't always agree. And this puts me in a little bit of an awkward situation because you might think that I'm very impolite to criticize her behind her back. But Nicole knows and Karin knows that if she were here, well, actually, if she were here, I wouldn't say the same thing. Because if she were here, I'd probably make the criticism a little stronger, since I know she could come back. So, but the point of my talk is not that I'm here to criticize Karin. It's that I wanted you to see that there could be a very friendly and serious and contentious exchange of ideas. So I'm really sorry that Karin's not here. But I have to move ahead. So the starting point is something I did talk about in the first chapter of my book, and it's really the origins of economic sociology, which, of course, one can trace back to founding figures in sociology, since all of them were certainly economic sociologists in part. But the modern day economic sociology can be traced back to what I called Parsons' Pact. So maybe none of you have to read Talcott Parsons anymore. I did, as the young, Nicole probably did too, yeah? Now Parsons was, I did too, yeah. Now Parsons was not a shy guy. He was actually wanted to colonize the social sciences, but because he was so very ambitious, he actually understood that there was one discipline that he would be better if he didn't take it on directly, because it could have the potential to sidetrack his efforts. And so he walked down the hall and up the stairs at the Littauer Center at Harvard University and talked with his colleagues in the economics department. Parsons was going to take over sociology and political science and anthropology and social psychology. And he made a good play, good run. But he told the economists, in so many words, I make no claim on your territory. So Parsons' pact, in essence, is you, the economists, get value. We, the sociologists, get values. You can study the economy. We'll study the social relations in which economies are embedded. That was a very important pact. It defined an object of study for sociology that was distinctive. It was very generative. It produced extraordinary work in economic sociology, but I didn't sign it. And it's not binding on me. But it continues to, I think, be reflected in two sort of dominant schools in economic sociology today. And the first is that economies are embedded in cultural values and cognitive frames. And the second is that economies are embedded in social relations. Now, in both of these approaches, calculative practices themselves are left examined. In a way, we still are bound by the pact. Calculation is here, but we're not going to study it. We're going to look at what it is in which it is embedded, or what it's embedded in, to be straightforward. We're going to look somewhere else, and we'll leave it to others to deal with what is calculation. And that is behind my work today. So maybe actually I should anticipate my response to Karen's talk today so you'll understand where I'm going to be going in this presentation. So the first moment is going to be to say, actually, I very much agree that financial markets are attention regimes, but I disagree that everyone has access to the same information at the same time, that we are all looking at the same information. I actually wrote down what Karen said. I could read it back to you. And how is it that traders in particular, who turn out to be quite reflexive, deal with the fact that they don't see everything all at once, that their scopes, their instruments to give them insight into parts of the market necessarily conceal other things, and how they deal with that. And the second, although Karen says that the new scopic instruments mean that we don't really need network analysis anymore, I disagree. But I don't disagree in the sense that I think we can do the old social networks. These are new kinds of networks. They are attention networks. And not everyone, because they're a network, has the same network position. And so I'm going to ask in the second part, and these are not social networks, they are bimode networks, two-mode networks in which we have persons and things, in which I ask the question with Matteo, does it matter who looks at what, and who looks at whom looking at what, and who looks at whom looking at what, okay? So that's where we're going to go. And the work is really made possible by work that Karen and others did, who came into economic sociology from science and technology studies. So I said that I didn't sign Parsons' Pact, and you didn't sign Parsons' Pact, but Michel Calon and Donald McKenzie and Karen Norsetina certainly did not. And they just didn't have to obey. They didn't have to say, we're going to look in some social relations elsewhere, we're going to look at values elsewhere. We're going to say, we're going to try to understand what is calculation. What are calculative practices? And they had students, Fabian Muniesa, Vincent Lepine, Yuval Milo, Alex Preda, and others. And one of the things they did was to help us understand that the object, these are now my words, not theirs, so they could disavow it, but this is my take on it, since in some ways I am also part of this community, that the object of sociology is not human beings. I mean, we can think about what do sociologists study? Well, one thing we say is sociologists study society. I actually have trouble with that since I I think the old notion of society as this nation state that's bounded, that's also a leftover from this kind of Parsonsian world, doesn't exist. But even more, I don't think that the object of study of sociology is human beings. I think it's the study of being human. And that's different because human beings cannot be human without having all kinds of a lot of other non-human things around us. In fact, we are the distinctive species that modifies our world. We change the non-humans around us, and evolving with our culture and with our material culture, with our ideas, that is what is distinctive about us as human beings. So what we need to do is have a society, a set of social relations that are populated not only by human beings, but also by technologies. So we're going to bring things, objects, models, algorithms, all kinds of things in the world, how desks are aligned, and other things into the study of economic sociology. So now network analysis in economic sociology views economies as embedded in social relations. But in our view, calculation isn't embedded in social relations. Calculation is itself social. Calculation is socio-technically distributed. It is not something that just happens up in people's heads. It is also out there in the world. Calculation is distributed socially among humans, and it is distributed socially among humans and our non-humans. So we could ask the question, what counts? What's important? We could also think about it, what counts? Kind of literally, we need to bring tools into the accounts about what counts in economic sociology. I want to talk just a little bit about performativity, since that's going to start the basis for my jumping off my paper with Daniel. I think you can see we have the book, Do Economists Make Markets? We have Donald Mackenzie's An Engine, Not a Camera. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of performativity, others not, but in any case, maybe this will be a good either introduction or refresher. We have here a declarative statement. Arena posting here on 2055 says, "This is a pipe organ in largest hall of Moscow House of Music." This statement, however, is different. It's not a declarative, it's a performative. I apologize. My speech act is my apology. It doesn't refer to anything else. It's not referring to something else, as in Arena saying, "This is a pipe organ in Moscow House of Music." I apologize is a performative. Let's don't get into how eventually linguists began to think about every action as a performative, but we want to make the distinction between a declarative and a performative. Now, following Mackenzie, the notion of performativity was brought into the study of financial markets because Donald argued very, very persuasively that financial models are not representations. They are interventions. And they format and they shape and they, what he says, perform markets. Their use, so very much important that the model, for example, has to be used, but their use brings new economic objects into being. So to illustrate that, let's start with this landscape, undifferentiated. And someone makes a model called a map. It's a line in it. And very importantly now, as a financial model for Donald and others who adopt this performativity idea, they have to make a predictive statement. And the predictive statement is, this is the way that people get from A to B. And the idea is that the more people who use the model, the more people will get from point A to point B in this way, and a new object will be created, a new kind of market, for example, in this case, a trail. So in my definition then, performativity, which is a perfectly good idea, but I think it can be misused because it can turn out that you think all kinds of things are performative, that the model itself performs the economy, which is not the case. It must be used by actors. But a model is performative when its use increases its predictive capabilities. And that was a generative idea, very important. It helped us to understand various kinds of financial markets. Daniel and I, however, wanted to think through things a little bit more, because it was not enough for us to sort of have this idea that there would be one model, one market. Our work in the trading room led us to understand that there could be multiple models in a market, and that traders didn't just sort of mechanically adopt certain kinds of models, but were actually reflexively aware of some of those limits and built in, now sort of keeping in mind our first move in economic sociology, which is what we want to do is we want to begin to think about reflexivity, but in a kind of material way. It's not going to be I'm reflexive because I'm somehow heroically able to escape my mind and go out over it and transcend it. We're going to have a reflexivity that is itself socio-technically distributed. So it is this move to reflexivity that's interesting for us. And by the way, and I would say this if Karen were here, what's very curious to us is that these people who come into economic sociology from science and technology studies, which was a discipline that had made as sort of one of its very central points the notion of reflexivity. In fact, they could have seen and did see themselves as a field, as the kind of reflexive part of science, that part of science that reflected on science. There's no role for reflexive action in their sociology for Calhoun, for McKinsey, or for Karen. And so we want to, it's not because we don't like the work that they did, it's because we like it and appreciate it very much that we want to push it further and build in a role for reflexivity. And see, first of all, well, are our traders reflexive or not? So, I mean, this just says that, basically. Why should we deny actors something that we prize and praise in our own profession? And so, instead of sort of thinking in our work to have more paper, another paper yet about performativity, we're actually interested in the skilled performance of these traders. As I said, it will be a distributed cognition, a distributed reflexivity. It will be a new form of sociality, which is not the old social network analysis about who knows whom in a very person-to-person way. It's a kind of network that is disembedded, but it's entangled. It's anonymous. Actors in our network that we're going to talk about here don't know each other, yet it is collective. It's screen-mediated. Yet it turns out it is differentiated. Everybody's screen is not the same. It has 160 traders, and Daniel and I go regularly over the course of 3 years. And the question we're going to ask here in this paper is, how do traders deal with the fallibility of their models? And not just that their models are fallible, but that they know that their models are fallible. So we go back to our declarative statement. This is a pipe organ. And we have another one. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Now, what is this one? Is this like a declarative? Is it a representation? Is it a referral to a representation? It's kind of challenging because it mixes it all together. It's not just a kind of performative. And we're going to see that in an even more interesting way in the poster of a biochemist who builds models in Scripps Howard in San Diego there, and it's ceci n'est pas une molecule. And he has it up there to remind everybody who's working in his lab that actually these representations that they make aren't actually molecules. And our traders do the same thing. I hope you can read the paper, because now in the next 5 minutes of summarizing it, I can just do violence to it, but you're going to see that the trading room is not just have models and devices, but it also has kind of devices for doubt. Devices that prompt across, and Daniel and I saw this across just one day, the traders to think, to remind them that their models are not the world. Okay? They are very much aware of that. The case we look at is arbitrage, and it's merger arbitrage. And we're going to show you how it is socially distributed. So first I need to talk about the cognitive challenges of using models in arbitrage. And we're going to deal with two kind of moments, or two times, two places in which a probability estimate is generated by a trader in a merger arbitrage desk. So the first one, keep this in mind now, is an estimate that's arrived at by the desk. The problem with a merger is a company announces that it's going to take over another company, and it typically announces that will have a date. And then the trading begins on whether that merger will take place or not. So the desk will come up with independently a probability estimate. But it also happens that there's something called implied probability, which we'll show you, which is the aggregate probability estimates of the trader's rivals. And it is in this interaction that all the interesting stuff happens. So like Karen, I have a trader and I have a screen. A given desk is going to make this probability estimate that's based on its own models, its proprietary databases, and so on. I have an example. The problem is the trader's models are very powerful scopes for viewing the market. But as traders will tell you, no one sees the whole market. And in fact, the more powerful my model as a way of helping me see things that others cannot do, the more these things really are, they're gestural in a new kind of way. Okay. As it helps me see some things, it conceals others. So, I mean, here's something that's not just relevant for finance, for the analysis of financial markets. It's that sort of every way of seeing is also a way of concealing. I mean, we see some things, and it means that we don't see other things. And the traders repeatedly socialize others on their desks, young people, about this knowledge, because if you take your model for granted, if you make the mistake of an economist of assuming for the moment that the world does exactly work this way, you can lose your shirt when reality strikes back. So what do the traders do? To avoid this kind of cognitive lock-in, now you have to have confidence in your model or you can't be a good trader, but you cannot mistake your model for a full-blown representation of the market. So they're going to turn to socio-technical networks that are outside the trading room. Now, economic sociology might then say, oh, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the relations between traders and their rivals. I guess if we could have the direct relations between traders and their rivals, or their friends, or whatever, or their friends who are their rivals. But these traders are more or less anonymous to each other. The best thing, remember, the problem is now, how do I avoid cognitive lock-in? That I take my model as a full and accurate representation of the market. The best way for me to sort of help myself to see what am I missing would be if I could see what's on your screen. If I knew that Nicole is a great merger arbitrage trader, if I could see what is on her screen, then it would help me to understand, like I've got 31 different variables on my Excel file. If she's got a 30-second and I don't have it, that would be very interesting for me. But there is no way that Nicole, as good of friends as we are, is going to let me see her proprietary model. Okay, that's deeply proprietary, so I can't see it. That's not going to be possible. What happens is that traders look at something else, which is a representation, in a way, that's produced by the actions of these anonymous others, and it is called the spread plot. And it is a kind of way of tracking the aggregate of the actions of other actors out in the market. Now, I've got to go through this faster because I want to also talk about the second stuff. So let's leave aside sort of in too great detail what the spread plot is. But in effect, it instantiates the diversity of dispersed anonymous actors. And what happens is I develop the probability estimate on my desk, and if there is dissonance, a difference, a discrepancy between what my model tells me to do and what I see happening in the spread plot, for example, my model just tells me I think that the price between the target and the acquirer should be narrowing because that merger is really going to happen, but I see the spread plot widening, then there's a dissonance. And that dissonance will disrupt, and it will prompt some reflexivity. I don't have to kind of heroically imagine that I'm going to be able to transcend my model. I'm going to be watching and observing that spread plot, and if I see that it moves differently than my model, then that might prompt me to ask a question. And what we show in the paper is literally this happens. It happens about an hour and 10 minutes after trading for a particular merger is announced at 9 o'clock in the morning. The desk does its work, takes a position, and the spread moves differently than they, and the head of the desk says, "What are we missing?" Literally. That's what he says. And what happens is it prompts research. I say research. It actually prompts more research, more search. So reflexive modeling is not herding. Herding is about economizing on search costs, right? I'll follow Matthias if I think I don't really know what's going on, and besides it's expensive and costly for me to search, but I have some confidence that he may know a little bit more than me, so instead of searching myself, I'll follow him. No, this one is different. I don't know Matthias, but I have some representation of this is very skilled work to understand that it is one's rivals and not just noise out there, but okay, that it's different, and it will prompt me to do more work. And the desk does that. Actually, in this case, they say, we're not missing anything, and we're going to bet more, okay? And if not, I might have changed, but it is this dissonance that makes the possibility of the moment for this action. So I'm going to say reflexivity is not some kind of self-awareness or conceptual transcendence, so as not to be captive of an epistemic trap. Traders use these devices for dissonance. Repeat that. This comes with a warning. Because in cases that lack diversity, when all of one's rivals converge too quickly on the same view of the world and there's basically nobody is disagreeing, that same possibility that a cognitive kind of interdependence, you had a position and I took a position, stops being independent and becomes interdependent. And cycles and the possible moments of dissonance evaporate, and it's a kind of consonance, a resonance that can build up, and we become more and more overconfident, and we leverage further our positions, even more narrowing the spread plot, and it can lead to disaster, which happens not on that particular morning in our trading room, but in the trading room we study, because our traders lost their shirts together with just about every other professional arbitrager in the largest arbitrage disaster in history, in which the professional arbitrage community lost an estimated $2.8 billion. And that's a lot of money. So if the system lacks diversity, the very same system, which could confidently help you to think that you have avoided risk, could actually compound it and lead to a collective disaster. And that's what these slides say. So, an effort to use something which consistently, but not always, could be a source of correction, could, by this circuit of cognitive interdependence, lead in rare, but as you could see, in some instances, very dramatic losses and through the amplification of error. So I have 15 minutes, I hope. Do I?
You have.
Good. I think I do.
You do.
Yeah.
It's probably true.
All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. And the paper I just did describe with Daniel is in the very most recent issue of Economy and Society. And I hope you'll have a chance to read it. This paper with Matteo is almost done, but it's not quite finished. And I'll look forward to getting critical comments from a lot of you. So what we're thinking about here is whether the previous work was kind of from performativity to performance or from performativity to reflexivity. Here we want to think about a move in which we're going to think about cognition differently than cognition is typically thought of in economic sociology, which I think is, for the most part, that it's categorical. And I think that's a real kind of problem, that we had some very good work that was done on categories and categorization, and then people said, well, that's all we need to know about cognition. So we're going to think about cognition. It's not that we think that categories don't matter. We just think that there might be something else to be gained by rigorously thinking about attention regimes as being actually attention networks in which not all actors have the same position. That one's position in this attention network might affect how one valued objects or assessed situations or understood an issue. So as I said, the dominant view, I think, reduces cognition to categories. And one of these examples would be in the work of Ezra Zuckerman, and you can better believe if Ezra were there, I would be making the criticisms directly to him, and he wouldn't shy away of disagreeing back, and it would go around, and you would see a lot of fun. But Ezra has a notion which is relevant for the not only for the general problem, but for the particular case that we're going to look at, because we're going to look at securities analysts. Our previous thing I just reported was about merger arbitrageurs. Now we're going to think about securities analysts. And Ezra Zuckerman has an idea that one of the ways that we could think about a security, a firm, is that it makes a kind of offering out there in the market, and that we're going to evaluate this offering, this security, as the way in which actors evaluate a situation, an asset, or size up a situation, whatever it is, by making a comparison. So the object isn't out there all itself, there's something else, and that something else is some kind of ideal type. And if the object is true, corresponds to, is some kind of instantiation of that ideal type, the more it is, the more it kind of gets the benefit of the doubt and is rewarded. And the more it is categorically ambiguous, hard to categorize, difficult to recognize, playing with too much ambiguity, it'll get slapped and penalized. Now, I can't tell you about the paper I presented this morning, but I can tell you that Ezra is in part right, because it is the case that things that are just really messed up get penalized. But it is also the case that things that are really innovative are oftentimes difficult to categorize. Right? And they are precisely really innovative and kind of game-changing and change the field when they're difficult to recognize at the beginning, but we come to recognize them. So there are huge rewards to being able to play the ambiguity of being categorically mismatched. And so since we have done that and shown it in other fields, we already are questioning that what the comparison that's taking place is between the object and its its sort of representation to the pure type. And so we want to think that, yes, there is comparisons being made in the first instance, but something much, much closer to home and very, very material. Whoops. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about a distributed cognition in two-mode networks. So it's a two-mode network because it is not just person to person, it is persons and objects. So person, object, person, or object, person, object. We can think about these, and we're going to exploit the fact that these actions, these assessments, these evaluations are happening within this two-mode network. And we're going to start with the insight from science and technology studies and from the world of the field of critical accounting. So I think, first of all, of the wonderful paper by Michel Calon and Fabian Muñeza in organization studies, or work done by our colleagues in the accounting department at ЛЭСИ and in journals like Accounting Organizations and Society, that calculation takes place within a calculative space. And this space is sometimes literally a space, and it is also one in which it's populated by humans and these sort of calculative devices, which can be fancy algorithms, but also be very kind of simple things. And we're going to be as absolutely primitive as we can be, and we're going to say the most elemental aspect of a calculative space are the other objects that are in my field of view. I don't even have to have all these devices and everything. We're just going to start with the even more simple one, that the most primitive is I am evaluating some asset and I am distributing, we call it allocating my attention across other objects. Right? That's going to be the starting point, because we're going to test whether how I allocate my attention across other objects affects my assessment of the focal object. Okay? And be patient. I think I can make this. I wish we could all just be sitting at the table, because then I could use these cups and everything, and I haven't yet figured out how to do that in a fancy PowerPoint. So we're going to play with the idea of location and allocation. We are not going to throw out the notion of focus. Remember, the title of the paper is Peripheral Vision. I'm actually interested in peripheral vision. It's not because I'm not interested in focus. It's because I actually think that when we focus on something, we are looking at it in relation to the objects that are in the ground. Right? So we have a figure and a ground, and the ground might matter. So allocating our attention and focusing are not sort of two entirely different things. They can be related. How I allocate my attention affects what I will see when I focus on the object, because I can only focus on it in relation to some background. And what we're wondering is, do agents make associations across the objects that they evaluate? So if I evaluate an object against this background, I may see some aspects of it. I may see aspects there in the background objects that I look for and either find or don't find in this object. Whereas if I'm analyzing it against the different background of objects, I may make other kinds of associations. This is completely primitive, and we want to just, first of all, in our first hypothesis, just test, does that happen? Then, if we can show that, we're going to move to sort of second-order observations in which not only my viewpoint, but also my viewpoint on your views could matter. So we could think about this work in a certain way as, whereas there's all kinds of interesting work that's happening in the field of economics on intersubjectivity, this is sort of complementing that with work on interobjectivity. So we're going to exploit the network ties that are created when multiple agents allocate their attention across multiple objects. And what that allows us to do is to study a socially peripheral vision. So Piero della Francesca was no slouch in thinking about perspective. Our apologies to him. We're going to argue that valuation is perspectival. And now I'm really going to talk fast because I want to get out my 4 hypotheses, tell you that we do a study with them, and then get your questions. So the first kind of idea is that how we assess an object or interpret a situation, as I said, is shaped against the background of the other objects or situations across which we allocate our attention. So the 2-mode agent-object structure of an attention network we're going to think about as a calculative space. And we're going to show that my views about a given focal object are shaped by your views and your viewpoints about other assets. This is not about, I'm going to just interested in how does Nicole, who's looking at similar objects to me, and we both share this same focal object. What do you think about this? It's not just that I'm watching what you say about this. It's I'm actually watching what you say about the other things that you're making assessments about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in fact, we're going to show that your viewpoint will affect my views. It's really, if I were just making that up, it wouldn't be interesting. But we're going to test this proposition. And what we'll see that is, in fact, what is in your peripheral vision can affect my focus. So the data are from something called I/B/E/S, which is always written that way. What it is, you can read in the paper. It's a data set that is in every good business school. We're going to look at it from 1994 to 2006. And what it does is every securities analyst who's any kind of player in this game will issue his estimate of the end of year earnings of a security, and he will make this available because there are prizes for accuracy and all kinds of things. So the data are pretty good, and they're checked by people, and if you try to game it and manipulate it, you're going to really get punished by the profession. And what we have are data on 15,000 firms. These are U.S. publicly listed firms. 8,000 analysts, and I say here 1.5. Actually, I think I was just talking with Matteo. It's several million. Okay, so our first hypothesis. Got it. Okay. Yeah. Let me say this. If how an actor interprets this given situation depends on, now we can think about the portfolio of situations that are in her field of view, then if we change the background objects, there should be a change in the estimate on the focal object. So we can do that by looking at one individual. We're going to have an object, and now seen in this, a stock, and seen against this portfolio, there we find a change. Do you see that? No, it's only me. Sorry. Okay, no problem. I have something on my screen. Okay. The change will yield a change in the estimate of that security. We're going to test that in a separate way. And that is, we have all the actors who have made an assessment of a security. So we have all the dyads. I can compare all of the assessments that are made of this focal security by all the pairs of analysts who issued an estimate about it. Which means that I can compare the distance that each of these analysts have in some kind of network space that's made up by whether their portfolios of other securities are more similar to each other or very, very different. And if they are very similar, we would expect that there will be greater similarity in our estimates of the focal security. And if they are very different, we say that we expect that we will find a difference in the estimate about the focal security. Hence, we would say that we could draw the conclusion, we could infer from that agents are making associations about the focal security from the other objects that are in there. And by the way, you can immediately say, but agents heard. You know, how do I know that I'm not close in my estimate to Nicole's estimate because she issued it last week and I'm just copying her? The database is so big that we can restrict all of our observations in this test only to those that are made on exactly the same day. Okay? So no herding is involved. Now, I am going to stop just to tell you there are two more hypotheses. The third, and the fourth deal with your views on these other objects. So we're not naive. As time goes by, I will read your views. Okay? But we're going to test whether Nicole's view and my view across time will converge or diverge depending upon how similar or how different are our portfolios across time. That is our test. And the fourth is we're going to test the effects. And remember, this is not like I am learning from Nicole about what she says about the focal object. The more I confront Nicole's views about other securities, not just S, but T, U, V, and W, and X, and Y, I am saying the more I will change my assessment of this security, okay? So it's in my peripheral vision. So the next moment, and now I end, is the extent to which we share common third analysts' views or not. Why are we interested in that? In the long run, the reason we're interested in it is because to the extent that these attention networks have closed loops, we start thinking, that could build up this kind of resonance structure in which we come to agree more and more and more and more, with the danger that we could collectively be quite wrong or collectively fail in our ability to understand changes that are happening out there in the market. Or conversely, that the more open these triads, the more we may confront each other frequently, but you are also attentive to some securities that are different and also are being looked at by different others, that these views won't converge. Those are our four hypotheses. That's kind of a way of thinking about them. We test them. Happy to share those results with you, and they are, whoa. Matteo is fantastic. They're fixed effects models with all kinds of controls on the relative status of the analysts, of their relative accuracy, of the industries that they're in, and so on. And our hypotheses are supported by these models. So I'll stop there and get your questions.
For a stimulating tour, to comment and a question. The comment is that most of these mechanisms that you examine in the two-mode attention networks are really variation of structural equivalence. There's a lot of support in many areas from international relations to input-output system, to psychological analysis, and this concept is very powerful and counterintuitive sometimes. But the question is that I really like the combination of this actor network theory with formal network analysis.
Yep.
Do you see in economic sociology more work coming through? What do you think its advantage?
Yes, I'll just take I took the first part as a compliment. It's interesting to think about structural similarity, and not just structural equivalence, but really which is kind of structural similarity. And the next was, what about actor network theory and American social network analysis? Something kind of like that. And I think that is where the most fruitful possible kind of intersection points, that's happening anywhere. Because social network analysis in its American, let's call it in Western European guise, has very powerful and very rigorous tools. But for the most part, it's been about social networks, sort of ego, actor, all these human beings. And actor network theory, on the other hand, has extraordinarily powerful sets of concepts, but it's not typically, at least recently, until very, very recently, used the kinds of quantitative methods that are being used by, let's say, for example, American scholars. And putting those two things together is exactly the place to try to be, I think, or one of the possibly interesting places. Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. That was very interesting. And I think I'm not sure I have a question, but I was listening to you. I was trying to actually connect Brian's presentation and Gary's presentation and your presentation, and I'm trying to make sense of how they work together. And if you're very a little done, and I would like to get your sense of whether my analysis is right or whether you see them differently. So if I go back to the notion of synchronicity that Brian wrote in, as basically kind of way to understand an homogeneous type of reaction that is relatively, the consequence of relatively discrete actions, in a sense, by individuals that are functioning in relatively discrete kinds of way. Then Karen tells us, well, it's a little bit more complex than that, because it's not so discrete. In fact, in a sense, they are embedded in some kind of both social background network and through the tool and the different tools that are actually pushing for performing in a sense this kind of homogeneous reaction with therefore more negative consequence, the possibility that actually you get wrong results and so on.
Yeah.
And you're going the next step, which is to say, well, they are not so, yes, there's a performativity, but they're also reflexive about it. But the way in which they are reflexive about it is by being embedded in a network that itself still nevertheless seems to generate some form of homophilia, or is based in some form of homophilia, which means that in a sense it doesn't really make a big difference ultimately. So I don't know whether it makes sense that all three of you are looking at it from a different angle, but in a sense the end result remains the same, except for the more positive maybe view of Brian on the ultimate consequences, and the more negative view that you share, it seems to me. So I'm not sure,
Yeah, all right, let's have a couple. I'm gonna throw another one in and we'll get a couple more. One, it seems to me that what you never use the term risk, but what it seems that they're trying to manage their risk. And they're managing their probably multiple kinds of risk. The risk of holding onto their desk at that particular firm, risk of their value of their portfolio, what they're trading. Do they think of it in terms of risk, or does it have another kind of a language? Because I think that's what a finance person would say. Oh, well, they're just hedging their bets, or they're hedging the risks, or whatever. And so let's throw another question out. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Great talk, very inspiring, and especially I think the idea of the blind spot of the observer is an idea that is worth reviving and operationalizing as you do. I was wondering, and I'm pretty sure you read Michael Lewis' Big Short, and the idea of these like 5, 6, 7 strange guys out in the US that somehow saw everything coming, whereas everybody else didn't see anything coming. Like the Iceman guy that had this weird sickness and he see it coming. And I was wondering, in terms of relation between a very interesting and huge data set, and if you're thinking also about maybe exploiting these guys, like maybe as an illustrative means, saying we also analyze the network of Iceman, and we can show that he has this particular position that allows him to see what he sees. Thank you.
Why don't you answer some of that now? We have 3 minutes by my calculation.
Okay, I'll just go backwards. Okay, let's imagine that I go to one of these traders and I say, now I figured out your network position, so tell me, why did you trade in that particular way? Okay, I think it could be interesting. I think probably in the same way that my ethnographic work stimulated some questions, that this new work with the big N with Matteo is going to generate new questions that we're going to take back to the traders. Will everybody be completely honest with me? I don't know. You know, one of the interesting things we learned, and now this makes me thinking about this to Karen, if she were here. One of the things that Daniel and I wanted to do back in the trading room was we noticed that everybody's screen is different. There's 160 traders and no two screens are alike. And in Karen's world, they should all be the same. And so Daniel took a camera in and he whipped the camera out and he said, okay, if I take a picture of your screen, I'd kind of like to document each of the screens in the room. And they said, you can sit here with us, but take a picture of my screen? No way. You know, that's deeply proprietary. Even how I've got it, to the colors I have on it, and you know, where I have this stuff. And this is my bread and butter. You know, no way. So sometimes what people don't tell you, when they refuse to tell you something, that's a very interesting signal as an ethnographer that you push the button and you got to figure out. And so that actually is what started us thinking about the differences in screens and the differences in what people are seeing. About risk, of course, you know, and I'm not the first person to say that an attempt to minimize or mitigate risk when it goes through some collective circuit can actually, if the system lacks diversity, can spin back and increase the collective calamity. And they do talk about risk, and this is a way of reducing, taking a big position, but in some ways reducing a bit your exposure. So yes, that's the language.
To what extent is that, if it all falls apart, is it something that is socially justifiable? Is that become part of a justification?
No, these guys don't.
No.
I mean, they will. If you ask them, you know, is it really justifiable that these arbitrageurs, get something? Sometimes they'll give you some sort of efficient market hypothesis notion that arbitrage ultimately does that, and then you talk with them in the next moment, and they go, of course we can't believe in the efficient market hypothesis, or we wouldn't be making all this money that we're making. But we really enjoy the ethnography, but I don't say I particularly enjoy these people. This is a case where, values do matter.
Your values.
Yeah, right. Okay. Who asked, Marie-Laure asked about embeddedness and synchronicity. Right, okay. I agree with Karen that the networks that we're looking at are not the kind of embedded networks that have been standard in economic sociology. They're not personal. They're not like about people who are their friends. They are anonymous. The spread plot is produced in a completely anonymous way. That these sort of structures of influence, which we seem to be finding, happen. They don't happen along lines of friendship. No, that's not it. So it's not embedded. Okay. Now, I think, I really need to hear Brian. I need to read Brian's paper and not just hear him talk, because he's so persuasive. It's just fascinating every time I see him. I would want to read this paper, but I know that from the work with Daniel, one of the things that I would be alerted to and think about is I didn't just sell you a bill of goods about reflexive modeling and how wonderful it is. I also said if the system at a particular moment lacks the requisite diversity, you can have disaster. And they were arbitrage disasters, and our guys felt it. So how I would think about synchronicity, I would also kind of think I mean, my understanding of a brain seizure, of a grand mal brain seizure, is it's actually about synchronicity. Like it's all those neurons in the brain or a certain part of the brain like firing at one time. So I would go, well, you know, when might synchronicity be an aid and when might synchronicity be a disaster? So that would be that. Let me just come back to Elon because, you know, I didn't really give a good response. Because what we're going to do now in future work is move way beyond the sort of structural equivalence. Because if you noted here, I didn't say anything about accuracy. I only said, are two and a dyad, do they become similar or different in their estimates, for example, over time, or in a structural moment, are they similar or different? What we're really interested in, we're really interested in this paper until we get it published, and then we're going to, you know, but what I think long term, we're interested in an actor's location within a community. And so then we're going to explore language of structural holes, language of structural folding, sort of the different structures of community and actors in them, and how these, especially the extent to which they're relatively open or closed, could be either beneficial in certain kinds of situations or disastrous, or beneficial or disastrous in others. So for example, if you're in kind of slow change, not really too much is happening, pretty standard kind of deal, routine is fine, then being in a closed community that gets the kind of information circulated around very quickly, but has got no diversity at all, might be perfectly adequate. But probably, this is our idea, would not be a good one for anticipating actions that are happening in cases where the old categories don't explain what's going on, and actually trying to follow. Right now, the only thing actually we're only looking at is the number, is the estimate. But we also could have access to their reports. So we think about how do certain terms come about, and how do those terms come about, not just depending on the structural equivalence or not of the actors, but of their discrete kinds of locations in different kinds of communities.